Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
All right, welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and we're here today with Barry Schwartz, who,
Great.
yeah, and who is, of course, Emeritus Professor at Swarthmore University, and you have some role here.
Visiting professor at Haas.
Right. By the way, for all of you professors out there who are thinking about retiring, come on out to California. We've got a wonderful kind of post-retirement life for you as an instructor and teacher here.
I completely agree.
Right? We've got a community here of people that will hang out with you. In fact, you know, the reason why I started this podcast was because I wanted to give people kind of a window into what it was like to be a faculty member, right? You know, when you're walking around campus and you run into people who are super smart and you kind of get to pick their brains, right? And so you're one of the earliest people I had on the podcast. And I think we spent most of our time talking about the book Practical Wisdom.
Yes.
Which I actually was able to see before it was published.
Yes, you
right?
sat in on a seminar.
Yeah.
I ran, yeah.
And then, of course, you've got the other books, The Paradox of Choice and Why We Work. And what brings us together today is this newest book, which you co-authored with an old colleague from Swarthmore.
That is correct.
It's called Choose Wisely, Rationality, Ethics, and the Art of Decision Making.
Yes, and Richard Schulden-Fry, my collaborator, was my closest colleague in the 45 years that I spent at Swarthmore before coming here.
Well, look, I mean, I like this book a lot. I think it, in many ways, encapsulates a lot of the things that you've been working on your entire life, which is at the boundary between psychology and philosophy.
I think that's correct, although I didn't expect you to like it a lot.
well, I mean, look, what you're trying to do in this book, as I see it, is kind of go after rational choice theory. And I think all of us, I mean, certainly all of us who have been in the social sciences for the last 30 years have been sort of marinating in rational choice theory.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter whether you're in a business school, like I was in a history program. My PhD work was in history, and we were schooled in rational choice theory as a way of modeling and understanding and explaining historical events, right? Try and get inside the mind of different historical actors and figure out what their objective function is, figure out what their constraints were, figure out, right, what the different trade-offs were that they had to deal with and so forth. I guess your criticism of rational choice theory is you're criticizing both the positive and the normative aspects of it. And I think also implicit is a critique of the way in which the practitioners of rational choice theory often fail to distinguish between, right, the positive and the normative. And I guess somebody who is a defender of rational choice theory, and I found it to be incredibly powerful and useful, they would say that you might be attacking a straw man, right? You're attacking sort of a stylized, distorted, exaggerated, and essentialist version of what, for many of us, we think of it as sort of decision hygiene, right? Sort of a process to run your decisions through to kind of look for flaws and errors, but it doesn't really necessarily provide you with, the important things, right? Like, what you should be doing in the first place. So to what extent, we'll have to dig into the critique, but I just want to give you a heads up on what I think the critique of your critique is going to sound like.
No, I'm sure you're right. And the question that has been in my mind for years is, when does a straw man stop being a straw man?
Right.
So, we make a point in the book of acknowledging that the way science proceeds is by simplifying.
Mm-hmm.
You simplify, figure out some causal relation, and then you build back up the complexity. Most of us don't do that second part.
Great.
And what happens, I think, in the case of rational choice theory, is that it is so seductive because you can get a precise answer to a highly imprecise question that people forget that they have to build it back up. That, as we say, it has its place, but that place isn't every place. And what has turned out to happen, as you point out in history, is that place has become every place. Mm-hmm. And the concern that we had is that people would forget how to think because they thought that they had a framework that made thinking no longer necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of a broader critique of so many things in the sciences, right? We make assumptions, and then we build these incredible castles on top of these assumption foundations, and then we forget that the foundations are built on assumptions, right? And so you pull those assumptions out, and the whole thing collapses. So the easiest thing to do is to not pull the assumptions out, right?
And it wouldn't be so bad or so concerning to us if it wasn't called rational choice theory. Rational is not a descriptor.
Right.
I mean, it is a descriptor, but it is also an honorific. And so it has the normativity built into it. This is the way decisions are supposed to be made. They are supposed to be made rationally. And what that means is you assess value and you assess probability and you do the math, and out comes the answer. Now, the work on decision-making that I've been a modest part of over the years, has shown that as a description of how people make decisions, it fails. Not that people never do it that way, but the set of heuristics and biases is now
so most JDM
triple digits.
Yeah, most JDM people would agree with that, right?
That is correct. But what has been so striking to me is that it's now half a century since Kahneman and Tversky essentially launched the field, is that no one has questioned the normative status of rational choice theory. It is just, this is the right way to do it, and people don't do it the right way, at least some of the time, often maybe. And so, what you said about how everyone, quote, knows that this is a toy model, that seems to have been forgotten. And the point of this book is to show that it is, as a model of rationality, it is deeply, deeply defective.
Well, I think there are other critiques of kind of the economic way of looking at the world, which I think is deeply intertwined with rational choice theory, right? Utility maximization,
yes,
and so forth. And I think that those critiques would argue that, the more people study economics and its implied normativity, their behavior changes.
Yes.
Right? And their values change, right?
Exactly. And I have made this argument myself in several different occasions that, that there is a more general problem in social science, which is that unlike planets, people are affected by claims that are made about what they're like.
Right.
And so the more we read social science and the more economics, the king of the social sciences, dominates the news, the more inclined we are to think like and act like economists. So does this tell us that economists have discovered something? No, maybe, but it's just as likely that what economists have done is create something. They've created a way of approaching decisions and value assessment and so on that is consistent with their framework and changed people as a result. Years ago, with Schuldenfrei and another collaborator, when I was a Skinnerian, and people listening to this probably don't even know what that even means. He was the dominant figure in psychology in the 50s,
well,
60s.
Anybody in the machine learning world understands reinforcement learning.
But it's amazing how different reinforcement learning has become in the hands of AI. But yes, so the argument we made, and we wrote a paper called Skinnerian Psychology as Factory Psychology.
Yeah.
And the argument we made there is that, Skinner is all about studying animals, doing things to get food and water, because incentives run the world. And what we suggested is that was not true of work that people did until the massive development of industrial revolution and factory system, where workplaces were created where there was simply no reason to show up except for the pay you were getting at the end of the day, Just as rats press a lever over and over and over again, you press a pair of pants over and over and over again, do the same thing 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And lo and behold, your behavior is governed by the payoffs. Well, what else might govern your behavior? So in effect, what we were suggesting is that the factory system changed people and created Skinner. And what Skinner was doing was simply describing the world as it was, but not as it had always been.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that the same sort of thing can happen when it comes to the powerful framework of economics.
Yeah, I mean, this is the notion of reflexivity, right?
Yes.
It's this feedback loop. Popper talked about it.
Popper talked about it, and George Soros actually wrote a couple of books about it.
Yeah. He is a Popperian, of course.
Yeah.
Studied under Popper, I think.
Yes, I think he did.
Yeah. And the idea is that, the models that we build to describe the world shape the world. I mean, they don't just shape our subjective perception of the world, but they actually shape the world that we live in, right?
And when I wrote a book years ago called The Battle for Human Nature, in which I made this kind of argument about economics and Skinner, and also the then new and hot field of sociobiology. And it was reviewed in the New York Times, and I was accused of being an idealist, meaning that the argument in the book was the way we think about the world changes the world. And it is true that the way we think about the world changes the world, but it changes the world materially. It doesn't just change the world because of the ideas we have running around in our heads. It changes the material world. The factory didn't exist, and then it did. And as a result, what it meant to work changed. And that wasn't in our heads. That was, a structure that was out in the world that made demands on the people who walked in the door every day. So it was not idealism. It was the argument was that ideas change not just how people think, but what kinds of things people are able to do. And I think the same thing is true with rational choice theory, though it's a bit more abstract. You can't do a rational choice analysis without being able to quantify. You have to be able to multiply things by each other. And the units that you're using have to be common units so that you can actually come to an overall conclusion. Well, there's research just recently done that shows that when you give people options that involve a trade-off, whatever dimension of the options is quantified dominates their decision. If you say restaurant is poor, fair, average, good, very good, it doesn't have the impact as if you say it's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5. And so all of a sudden,
it's like metric fetishization.
It's metric fetish. Exactly. And so you're pushed to find a way to quantify, because it is in quantification that you have knowledge, that you have certainty. And you can see this operating. U.S. News and World Report somehow is telling us what the best colleges and universities are by reporting the things that can be quantified. And if what's the quality of an education is not so easily quantified, then you do a survey and you report what people who supposedly know something say on a 10-point scale is the quality of an education. But you can quantify what the acceptance rate is. You can quantify what the average salary is of a graduate 5 years after graduating. You can quantify how many pre-meds get into medical school. There are lots of things you can quantify the size of the endowment, and that ends up driving the decision by U.S. News and World Report, which in turn drives the decisions of people who are applying. And the question of where will I get the best education has somehow gone into smoke. It's not there. So the fetishistic embrace of things that can, there's a maxim in business that I'd never heard of until I started teaching here. Be careful what you measure, because what you measure is what you'll get. Well, colleges have certainly shown, in the case of U.S. News and World Report, that what they measure is what they get.
Now, it's related to Goodhart's law, right? Because, you also are going to design incentives around that. And then that's when the metric ceases to be super valuable.
Right? No, that's right. But people somehow think that there is a bulletproof way to design incentives so that they won't distort what it is the incentives are designed to encourage. And the bad news is there is no such thing. And there's no system that can't be gamed.
Well, this idea of reflexivity, I did a podcast recently with Donald McKenzie, who's a sociologist of finance, and he, described how when things like Black Scholes were published, that the prices actually converged to.
Yes, I wrote about that.
Yeah, but the thing is, in my behavioral finance course, I talk about this reflexivity all the time, but it also extends into other areas of life. I remember back when I was a student at Wharton, I remember overhearing some of my classmates talk about their children as depreciable assets, right? Right, and they're talking about going long a relationship or short a relationship, and I think they were kind of doing it in jest, but also kind of not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, it starts out in jest. Obviously, I'm not stupid enough to think that the framework that I use in my finance decisions can apply to everything. But it's sort of cute to use that language. But if you use that language enough, that's how you start thinking about things. There's an example that I sometimes write about where, you work in consulting. Let's say you get $500 an hour. Your friend calls up and says, "You want to have a beer tonight?" And you think, wow, that's 2-3 hours. Is this friend worth $1,500?
Yeah. Well, but look, that doesn't mean that the concept of opportunity cost is a bad one. I teach this in week 1 of our microeconomics class, right, where somebody's trying to figure out whether or not to, install sprinklers themselves or, bring in a contractor to do this. And when I walk through my calculus, when I go down to Sanford, I take Uber because I did the math. And at first I was thinking, $75, that's an awful lot to pay when I can drive for free. But then when I realized that, hey, I'm spending an hour, driving, and that's it. And what's my billable, right? I could be preparing my slides and I could be, doing all this other stuff. It makes no sense for me to turn down a $500 an hour job over here and then, say yes to it. So like that, I think, is a sensible way to look at things as long as you sort of constrain it to the things that are measurable in that way.
But that's the problem. I have no problem at all. In fact, I think it's essential for people to think about what I like to call missed opportunities. But there's a big difference between missed opportunities and opportunity costs, because the expression opportunity costs implies that there should be a way to put a dollar value on the opportunity that you're missing. So in the case of you taking an Uber, I could be earning $500 in this hour trip. Instead, I decide I'm going to save 75. That doesn't make any sense. But missed opportunities don't always fall conveniently into a metric that we would call a cost.
Sure, but look, I think there are different levels of granularity one can engage in this process with. So, Benjamin Franklin articulated the sort of balance sheet method of decision making, which I certainly encourage all of my students to use, even for very, very important life decisions.
Yeah.
Like, should you get married, right? Well, it can't hurt.
Darwin is the classic example.
It can't hurt to sit down and kind of evaluate the pros and the cons. And so I think it would be hard to critique that process.
No.
The problem is that when you want to find a single metric that makes all of these things commensurable, right? That's when you get into trouble.
Right. So what we say in the book is that creating a spreadsheet is a terrific idea, because there could be aspects of a decision that you're simply not thinking about or you're not giving enough attention to. And when you create a spreadsheet, there it all is. And we suggest, this is counterintuitive, once you've created the spreadsheet, the work is done. The mistake comes when you think you can then put numbers in the cells that somehow make comparisons commensurable and quantitative. The most important work is done when you create the spreadsheet, and then you can throw it away.
Sure. And I remember when I was in grad school, I took a course on decision making, and it was with I think it was with Howard Kunreuther. You know
Sure.
And we would do, it's an analytic hierarchy process. I think that was what it was called. I forget, but we would do that, and then of course you would assign weight to each of the different factors, and then you would assign values to each of the factors.
And you push a button.
And you push a button and you add it up. And of course, you'd look at it and be like, nah. And I think that's actually what they do when they're evaluating these colleges, right? So they'll say they have this formula, but when they use the formula and Harvard comes out like number 30, then they just
we made a mistake.
They go back and fix the formula, right? So they kind of start with where they want to wind up anyway. And
I think that's probably true. And what that says to me is that there's a lot going on when we're creating a spreadsheet that we then abandon when we think that the way to proceed is by filling in the spreadsheet. It takes judgment to know how important various things are and how certain you are about the consequences of things. And that judgment, the world resists formulaic decision-making as much as we might wish it didn't. It isn't an accident that the real progress in artificial intelligence came when they stopped trying to build rules into the program and instead let the program learn. And exactly what the program learns, as far as I know, nobody can tell you. All they can tell you is that it sure acts like it knows what it's talking about most of the time. But the big revolution came when people stopped thinking the best way to create a chess-playing program is to put all the rules into the program.
But I mean, aren't these techniques good ways to, I don't know, facilitate self-discovery, right? So, if you go through and you do that exercise that I just described, and then you get to the bottom and you go, oh, wow, like the numbers don't add up. Then you can sort of say, I guess what the way in which I understand this thing is these are non-linear combinations, right? And so, maybe now I understand that this thing is only valuable to me because I have it in conjunction with this thing, right? And so, if you use it as a technique of self-discovery, I mean, if you go back to Kahneman's example that you talk about in the book, right, the colonoscopy example, right? When you walk through that exercise, you realize that the way in which you view things retroactively is different from the way in which you experience them contemporaneously.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I think it's only when you go to the next step and you say, the only proper way to evaluate it is retrospectively or prospectively or contemporaneously. Now, that's when I think you make the mistake. But I certainly think it's enlightening for you to say, oh, gosh, that's so weird. Like I had this horrible vacation. The last day was fantastic. And now I think it was fantastic.
Yeah.
Like that, your eyes open. That's really cool. And I think it's only when you're trying to figure out, well, what do I do with that?
No, I agree with you that it is a potentially extremely useful tool for self-discovery. But the problem is that what it takes to make it a useful tool for self-discovery is all the processes that are excluded from the description of rational choice theory. So if you go through the spreadsheet and you get an answer that doesn't make sense to you, the question then is, what did I do wrong? Did I give too much weight to some things? Did I overvalue the quality of some options? Do I not know how to think about probability in an uncertain world? What was my mistake? And it's hard to discover much from this process of self-discovery without figuring out the answer to that question. And you know what we call that? We call that thinking.
Yeah.
And the main argument in this book is that we shouldn't let rational choice theory be a substitute for thinking, or to be more prosaic, we shouldn't let counting be a substitute for thinking.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the danger of emphasizing self-discovery over self-improvement is that no matter what you do, you've got some kind of explanation for it. Like, for instance, an example in the book, there's somebody, and I know plenty of people like this, who are running credit card balances at 29%, and they have money sitting in their savings account at 2%.
Yes.
And you're like, what the hell's going on here, right? And this makes no sense at all, right? From an economic perspective. pay off the dang credit card and be done with it. And then, you'll talk to people and they'll say, well, yeah, but I lack self-control, whatever. This is a mechanism for whatever. Okay. Maybe if they're, I don't know, if they have that self-knowledge, they might actually say something like that. But, this might then say, hey, my lack of self-control is costing me this.
Yeah.
Now that it's been brought to my attention that, if I could just figure out how to pay my dang bills on time, I had this conversation with a friend of mine recently who is, in her 50s and broke. And I'm like, if you just paid that one bill in February of 1992 on time, and then you would have all the same things you have now and you have $1 million in the bank. Right. And then when she said, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that this was costing me this. I really need to figure out a way to get some self-control, So I think if you tell a story that says, well, they get utility out of being irrational, done, right? Then I think it's unsatisfactory, right?
Well, I wouldn't say they get utility out of being irrational. I would say they get utility or benefit out of keeping various different kinds of considerations in their place.
This is the framing.
And, the problem with the example that we talk about at the end of this book, this person who is making various mistakes that could be fixed pretty easily, but all in all, thinks she's living a pretty damn good life, is that the worry is that once you start thinking about these relatively unimportant deviations from optimality too much, it changes the way you think about everything else. And so she is willing, at least as we describe it, she's willing to pay a price, financial price, in order to maintain balance between things in her life that matter and give different things the attention that she thinks they deserve. Is there another way that she could be doing it and have more money in the bank? Absolutely.
Well, I think the critique that a rational choice person would say generously is, if she knows the price she's paying and she assents to it, that's very different.
That's her business.
From, just kind of putting your head in the sand,
that is
not realizing the consequences of your actions. I mean, you can't actually do that comparison unless you have full information, right?
That's correct. And I think just today there was an article in today's New York Times about people who sign up for essentially an infinite number of credit cards to get the bonuses that are attached. Once you spend a certain amount, you either get a cash contribution or you get a trillion points, you get something. And, people have made thousands of dollars rotating 50 or 60 or 75.
Or ever seen Extreme Couponing, that TV show?
No, I haven't, but I'm sure that's the same thing. But they all make clear, the ones who are interviewed in the article, that this is not something to do casually. This is something that takes an enormous amount of time and attention. Because if you screw up, you will end up in this cycle of revolving credit that you can never extricate yourself from, and it will cost you thousands. So you really have to be monitoring everything and stop using this card at just the right time and start using this card at just the right time. So if you want to take a second job, and that job is managing my credit cards, be my guest. But it's not free money. So I think the person we describe at the end of the book is somebody who does not want that to happen to her life. And so she's made compromises. The unknown question that you ask is she aware of what it's costing her to do this, both literally and also metaphorically? And, it's up for grabs. The way we describe her, she sort of knows that she's paying a price for all of these peculiar habits. She probably doesn't know how big a price, but she doesn't want to know how big a price, because then it will upset, she's worried, upset the balance that she's managed to strike between various things that matter to her.
Yeah, but surely, I mean, it's worthy of stress testing these things, right? So a lot of these things are tied up in identity. I mean, I'm one of these people who's like, I like physical books, right? This is like my identity. Ever since I was 2 or 3 years old, I dreamed of living in a place that, was like Trinity College's, library, right? But now I'm paying the price. And I had to step over piles of books to go to the bathroom, and I'm starting to think, maybe this identity.
Maybe there's another way.
Maybe I don't need to do this. Or I remember when I got my new house, I had all these fireplaces, and I was like, I'm a wood fire guy. Like that's my identity. I'm a traditionalist. I'm a wood fire guy. And I had a friend who said, you realize that if you just have a wood fire, like you'll only have one fire every year because it's such a pain in the butt. And I thought, I'll never do gas fires. And I thought about it, ruminated on it. I thought, okay, there's a two-way door. I'm going to try it out. I put in the gas fire, and it's the best thing ever.
Yeah,
fire every night. Right?
Yeah,
fire last night, right?
We have one too, and it is indeed the best thing ever.
So I mean, just having surfacing it, understanding exactly the what are the components of this identity, and just understanding that it comes at a price. I don't think
I agree with you completely. Notice,
right?
Surfacing it, thinking about it, understanding it. I agree with all of that. Those words are not present in rational choice theory. This is what we mean, I think, by thinking. It's certainly what my collaborator, Richard, and I mean by thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's what most people mean by thinking. But rational choice theory is a substitute for thinking. And all we're arguing is that it is a bad substitute for thinking, which is, again, not to say that it won't, if you go through the exercise, occasionally surprise you about habits you've gotten into, waste of time and effort and money that you've just stopped noticing, et cetera. And it can get you through this sort of self-education to change some significant aspects of what you do. But the key mediator here is that you think about what this analysis reveals. Mm-hmm. And there's no place for that in rational choice theory, because it's supposed to give you the answers. And what you're describing, and what I agree with, is that it doesn't give you the answers, it gives you some data, and you then have to think about what the data imply. And I'm all for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we could dig into this concept rational, because, while rational choice theory might be relatively recent, I mean, we have been striving to be rational since philosophy, first showed up on the scene. And so rational has a wide range of meanings. I think we can all agree that being rational is better than being irrational.
Yes.
I mean, obviously there are some people who are proponents of irrationality, and maybe it has its place. But I think most of us think that as humans, rationality is what we strive for.
Yes, and this book is certainly not an argument against being rational.
Right. And so I guess we could talk about how rational choice theory came to represent a view of rationality that is a departure, perhaps, from, say, the Aristotelian view of rationality. And I think each view of rationality has like a canonical choice, right? And rational choice theory, the canonical choice is a gamble.
Right.
And what I find, I used to teach animal behavior, and what I found fascinating is that animal behavior is much more rational than human behavior. Right? You can actually use rational choice theory much more effectively to describe what animals are doing. When they're foraging, when doing mate selection and all this stuff. Like, you can build these really good models that are super, super robust. And then when you look at humans, they oftentimes fall apart. So animals are not doing computation explicitly with calculators and spreadsheets, but they seem to be doing it implicitly.
Yes.
So does rational choice theory really need explicit computation in that sense?
Well, I think from its own point of view, the answer is yes, because you need to assign, first of all, you need to list the alternative courses of action.
So normatively. So positively, we can have implicit.
Right, and there was an article again in today's New York Times about how baseball managers make decisions. It's playoff time, and everyone's paying a lot of attention. And this notion of, quote, tutored intuition, that they're going with their gut, but they've been in the sport for 40 years, and their gut has a lot to tell them. So it's different for me to go with my gut as a manager and for the manager of the Dodgers to go with his gut as a manager, not because going with your gut is a good thing, but because tutored guts have a lot to tell us. So I think as a description, I don't know that rational choice theory would care that people are not deliberately following the steps as long as they're getting the outcomes that rational choice theory would lead to. If the mechanism is different, fine. And in the case of animal behavior, and I used to teach it too, optimal foraging theory, we don't necessarily know what it is, what the signal is that gets an animal to leave this patch and move to another patch. But the presumption has been that there's a kind of calculation going on, and when the food density in the patch you're in gets below the food density in the more general area, that's a signal to switch. How is that being detected? How is it being calculated? Those are all interesting questions. I don't care about the answers to them. It's a powerful model of how there is a machine in the animal doing the calculation. But the thing about that is animals eat because there's an evolutionary program telling them you have 3 jobs. Your job is to get enough energy to survive, avoid getting eaten, and produce babies. That's it. And don't tell me you want to self-actualize, and the tight constraints imposed by these mechanisms essentially make it so that animals are not sitting around deciding whether they want to enrich their lives in one way or another. And when I say this, I don't mean this is necessarily true of all animals, but certainly it's true of most. So they are machines with particular functions, or they consist of a set of machines, each of which has a particular function, and how the function is actually embodied and realized is an interesting and challenging research question. But this notion of weighing what matters, what's important, how things that seem completely different can be compared, that's not a part of the world that these animals inhabit. And rational choice theory is not meant to just tell you when to leave this patch and go to that patch. It's meant to tell you how to live your life.
Well, maybe we can talk about the difference between a closed problem and an open problem.
Yes.
Right. I teach strategy, right? And part of what I'm trying to teach the students is how to convert open problems into closed problems, because you can't act until you do, right? I mean, you can't decide until you say, all right, look, I'm going to simplify the world. I'm going to have to block out certain things, focus on certain things. And I think the example I use is, just did this yesterday, is, you're looking for a decision tree, at least in the world of business, right? You're looking for a decision tree and you're faced with a big bowl of spaghetti, and you somehow have to find the decision tree buried in the spaghetti. And so you're converting a world that is full of uncertainty and full of unknowns and full of incommensurate things into something that you can actually act upon, right? And you're not arguing that we shouldn't do this, right? Because you have to. It's just that you're arguing that you have to acknowledge that you're doing it and how you're doing it, and that there are better and worse ways of doing it.
That's exactly right. So you mentioned a few minutes ago the word framing, which in the decision-making world is regarded as one of the sort of super biases.
Well, narrow framing is.
Narrow framing.
Yeah.
That is to say, we are very much influenced by how the choice situation is described. And if you describe it as a choice among possible gains, people make one decision. If you describe it as a choice among possible losses, they make the opposite decision. And you can manipulate that simply by creating the framework within which a decision has to be made. So this is narrow framing. You should be able to see through the description to the underlying reality that's being described and not be influenced by the frames that the experimenter gives you. Fine. So it's a mistake. And it's a big mistake because it can show itself in a million different situations. The argument we make is that framing, though it can certainly go wrong, is what enables you to get started. You can't do a rational choice theory analysis without framing. In fact, you can't do it without narrow framing. And the question is, how narrow? And you don't answer that by using rational choice theory. You know, there's an example we describe in some detail by a former colleague of ours, Michael Pollan, about trying to figure out the price of a pound of beef.
Right.
And, you know, he buys a heifer and watches it get fattened up and slaughtered and calculates how much profit he's made from this investment in a cow. But then he starts to muse about, you know, what economists know about, they call them externalities, lots and lots of costs associated with the raising of this cow that are not reflected in the price of a pound of beef. You know, like antibiotic-resistant bacteria that come because these cows are dosed with antibiotics. So how many people get sick and get seriously sick and maybe even die because their bacterial infections are harder to treat than they would be if we were not profligate in our use of antibiotics with cows. Petroleum products, which are used to fertilize, which can conceivably have an effect at the margins on our foreign policy. The subsidies that farmers get for growing corn, because corn fattens up cows faster than grass does. Well, so we're paying for a pound of beef with our taxes. Now, none of that is included in the supermarket sticker. All of that is properly regarded, I think, as a cost of raising a pound of beef. And the question is, how do you frame this so that you come up with an answer that is broad enough to be responsive to the problem, but not framed so broad that you can't do the analysis because it never ends, you know, everything is connected to everything.
But look, I mean, isn't it a virtue to expand one's frame and think more broadly? I mean, when we look at so many of the perverse outcomes, whether it's the financial crisis, whether it's COVID, whatever, you know, you can point to people just assuming away all sorts of stuff. I mean, this is actually what the critique of rational choice.
I couldn't agree more.
Itself is about, you know, they're engaging in this framing exercise.
Yes,
is too narrow. I mean,
broadening the frame is a great idea, and rational choice theory certainly pushes us in the direction of establishing that frames that are too narrow. Absolutely, but rational choice theory isn't what's going to get you to broaden the frame.
Well, it can. Like, let's go back to this example of, you know, my taking the Uber versus driving the car, right? So I could just say, well, look, Uber's $68, and then, you know, the toll is $7, right? Well, and someone comes on, well, hold on, you got to pay for parking, right? Oh yeah, it's another $20, and then you got to pay for the wear and tear on the car, and it's like, well, I mean, how do you calculate that? Well, there's no accurate way, but let's just say $1 a mile. And then, you know, you got to factor in the cost of your time. And, you know, obviously you can't extrapolate to the impact that you're going to have, you know,
on the planet.
Like, I have a BMW, this is going to be a Prius, and therefore, like, I mean, you know, there's what's the probability I'm going to get a Prius versus a Tesla versus in fact, like, okay, so obviously you're going to have to circumscribe it some way.
Yes.
But so there's you could do it too narrowly, you could do it too broadly. There's I think you pitch moderation, right? That's what practical wisdom is.
That's
understanding where to draw that frame.
But it takes judgment to figure out what moderation is in a given situation. And furthermore, let me just say, rational choice theory is not neutral about what stays in the frame and what goes outside it. The things that go outside the frame are the ones that are most difficult to quantify using the same scale that you're using for everything else. And so, in the case of the price of a pound of beef, you could add the amount of money that our taxes contribute to subsidies. you could factor in the costs of the fertilizers that enable the corn to grow enough so that the cows can get fattened up. How do you quantify exactly the cost to human health? You can do it. How many more dollars do we pay per year because of disease, antibiotic-resistant bacteria? But does that capture the cost in health? No, it only captures the dollar cost in health.
Well, I mean, let's go back. I think it was Cass Sunstein when he was at the Clinton administration, right? He's saying, yeah, cost benefit analysis, right? You're going to do it whether you like it or not.
Right.
And so if we look at and we see OSHA is effectively passing regulations where each life saved costs, 40 million. And then EPA has a law where each life saved is, 2 million.
Right.
I mean, isn't it sensible to say, hold on a second, like we can save more lives if we redistribute, if you make the OSHA regulations a little looser and the EPA tighter and the EPA, right? And this is not implying that we think a life is worth 7 million. It's saying like we should act, if we're going to act as if it's worth 40 million in one case, 2 million in the other, there's something wrong with that.
I agree. And I think that being mindful of the implicit dollar values that are placed on things is a very good idea, because you have to justify policies with cost benefit analyses. But there's a big difference in my mind between cost benefit analysis and cost effectiveness analysis. With cost effectiveness analysis, your goal has been established, whatever it may be. And the question is, what's the most effective way to achieve that goal? With cost benefit analysis, the question is this a goal that we should aspire to achieve? And there, the incommensurabilities loom much larger. And yes, inconsistent pricing of human life doesn't make sense. But the danger is that we will, whether we mean to or not, we will come to regard the value of a life as whatever numerical value policy institutions have ascribed to it. Does that have to happen? No, of course it doesn't have to happen. You can remind yourself in the shower every morning as you're getting ready to go into the office and do those cost-benefit analyses that human life is more than that.
But wait a second. I mean, at its best, right, this kind of cost-benefit analysis or JDM, what it forces you to do is to boil down those ends, those benefits into their kind of component parts, right? So, you might have a goal and say, oh, well, I want a house and I want a car. And then you're trying to figure out, like, wait a second, let's ask yourself, why do you want a house? Right? Why do you want a car? Maybe what you're really looking for is shelter. Maybe what you're really looking for is stability. Maybe what you're really looking for is mobility, right? And so you're looking for a way of comparing these ends that is more essential. And you say, well, okay, hold on a second. You can actually compare the house versus the car. And ask yourself, like, which is giving you more of what you're really looking for, which is security or, whatever. I mean, isn't that a worthy?
Absolutely. And this, as I said before, is what we call thinking.
Okay, fair enough.
No, I'm not disputing any of that. I think people should be reflective about the decisions they face, about the decisions they make, about the effects of the decisions they make. I don't think people should be formulaic, which is not to say that it's never appropriate to be, when you go to a gambling casino, for God's sakes, know the odds. That's what it's for. It's for situations like that. Incredibly narrow framing, incredibly limited set of outcomes, incredibly precisely specifiable probabilities, and no ambiguity about the outcome of any gamble. It's either a 7 or it's not a 7. It's not a 7-ish. So it is the gambling casino and all kinds of other kinds of gambling is essentially designed to be the model of what rational choice theory can handle. So if instead of asking themselves whether the decision they're facing can be usefully handled by rational choice theory, people might ask themselves, is the decision they're facing will be effectively handled by treating it as what to bet at a gambling casino? That makes it, I think, more stark what it is you're doing when you decide to rely on rational choice theory. And there's a woman, Annie Duke, who's written now a bunch of books and was a world-class professional poker player, maybe still is.
Yeah.
She wrote a book called Thinking in Bets, and her argument is very much like yours. It isn't that everything we do in life is a bet. It is that we can get real insights about decisions if we think about them as if they were bets. But there is an implicit, and then we back away and ask, what is this framework leaving out? And without that step, then you have essentially turned your life into Las Vegas. And I don't think that that's what people regard as the high road to rationality. Do you?
Yeah. Well, let me return to practical wisdom, because I think, this goes through all of your work. The notion that phronesis is something we should all seek after and pursue. And that really is what rationality is at its best.
That's my view.
Right. And maybe look at education. We're both lifelong teachers, been in the educational space our whole lives, and we've been teaching people at various levels. And I used to think that the goal of the university was to actually impart some practical wisdom, help people to, figure out how to lead better lives, become better people, and so forth. And I think if you were to look at the current literature on education, you wouldn't recognize that. And it's kind of like, all right, we're going to teach people how to get jobs. There's an element of it, I think, in okay, we want to make people learn a few things about what's wrong with the world and make the world a better place and so forth. But it's not so much about what used to be called self-discovery, but self-discovery in the process, in the service of wisdom. So what can we do? And you're in a business school now, right?
Yeah.
So we're teaching people to live practical lives. How do we impart wisdom? How do we import it into the professions? I mean, that was really what your last book was about. Really.
So first of all, I agree with your characterization of what universities should be doing and what they are doing, and how there is a very big mismatch. I taught a course for 5 years at Haas called Work, Wisdom, and Happiness. And the point of the course was to suggest that the secret to happiness, no secret, is work that matters and close relations to other people. In order to both have and do effectively work that matters and maintaining close relations to other people, you need to be wise. And so if we want people to be happy, we need to find a way to cultivate wisdom. And I would tell the students, and this no doubt pissed them off, said, listen, I don't really care much about whether you end up happier as a result of this course. If you do, great, but that's not why we're here. We're here.
Did you do that on day one?
Day one.
Can't lose a couple people.
I invite people to leave. We're here because you people are going to be running organizations. And what I care about is not your happiness, but the happiness of the people you employ. And so if you have an understanding of how well-being contributes to to job performance and overall life satisfaction, maybe you'll organize the workplace to enable people to get some satisfaction out of what they do. And maybe that'll make you happier too. So I tell them that. But the problem is, at least my take on the problem, is that in a diverse society like the one we currently live in, you can't say, my aim is to help you live a good life, without unpacking what good life means. And you can't simply leave in parentheses good life for you.
So they go to the bus, right? You know,
Exactly.
yeah,
And we live in a society where no one has the right to tell anyone what a good life is and what they should be doing. And what that, there used to be a time when the president of the university would teach a seminar for graduating seniors, the president of the university. And the point was to teach them how to go forward into the world and be good people. Well, no one would have the chutzpah to do that now. Maybe in some tightly religiously based universities and colleges, there's less self-consciousness about telling people what it means to be a good person. But in the sorts of liberal arts places that we know about, no one would have the nerve to teach a course like that.
but by not doing it, you're doing it, right? I mean, you are.
I think you are.
You can't not do it.
I think you can't not do it, and we should just bite the bullet and do it. And
Right.
and if it makes some people unhappy, or if some people feel that they're not being adequately represented, you talk about it with them. You try to be somewhat broader in your understanding of what a good life is as you get educated by people who feel excluded. But you don't not talk about it as if by not talking about it, it goes away. And there's a collective massive failure of nerve on the part of academic institutions when it comes to undertaking what I think is their main responsibility, which is to create good people and good citizens.
Well, I mean, it does seem like even if you think, all right, fine, there are lots of different legitimate approaches to the good life. Even if you believe that, why would you have to think that they all have to coexist in a single institution? Right? Couldn't the institution brand themselves and say, okay, if you go to UC Berkeley, there's a shared belief that this is the good life. And if you go to Stanford, there's this belief. And if you go to Chicago, there's this belief. At MIT, and then you could actually build communities, right? Like in the old days, you have these religious schools with different points of view. So wouldn't that be a way? I mean,
it would be a way.
It would reduce mobility of faculty, I guess.
And it would divide society even more than it's currently divided.
You think? I mean,
I do. There
were Baptist colleges and Methodist colleges and Catholic colleges.
Yeah, but all these Christian colleges, at least at some point in the past, had at a deep level a shared understanding of what it meant to live a good life and what it meant to nurture good people. To the extent that they don't share that, then what they're doing is creating cults. They're each creating their own cults. And what often happens, as Freud called narcissism of small differences, is that these cults see their kissing cousins as their main enemies instead of people who are, miles away from them. So it's not it's not like there are different flavors of Christianity, pick your flavor. It's like there are different flavors of Christianity. Some of them are holy and some of them are not. And you have to choose the right one and then do what you can to destroy the wrong one. And that's what I worry is where this sort of thing leads, without some kind of common understanding of what universities are for. Now, in the glorious days of the past, it wasn't hard to get that understanding because everybody who ran the university basically came from more or less the same place. You came from Harvard or you came from Yale or you came from Princeton, and you could just take it for granted that what they were doing across town is the same thing that what you were doing, and what they wanted to do is the same thing as what you wanted to do. And those days are not present. And I myself am not smart enough to figure out how to have this kind of commitment in educational institutions when the underlying agreement about what a good life looks like is no longer present.
Well, but hold on. I mean, is there a lack of let's suppose rational choice theory is the dominant sort of view of decision making, of understanding mankind, et cetera, in our top universities today. Does that mean that these communities do not have a vision of the good life, or does rational choice theory have an implied vision of the good life that it is is perpetuating, right? And if so, what is it? And should we brand ourselves? Like, should we say, okay, yeah, if you come to this university, if you come to this business school, you come to this law school, you're going to be taught that this is what the good life is. Now we could, honesty in advertising. And so, your vision of a good life is a job at this kind of company with this kind of car, this kind of family, this kind of life, right? Whatever. I mean, is there an implied vision of the good life, or is it completely neutral? Rational choice.
I think in principle, it's neutral. In practice, it is highly biased. And what makes it biased, I come back to this once again, is this emphasis on quantification.
Which ultimately leads to money, right?
Which, well, it's the one scale we got that we know what it's about.
Right.
So rating scales,
right.
They're for, flimsy social sciences like psychology.
So utility maximization quickly morphs into
wealth maximization. Right. It does. And it's not inevitable. And you can, of course, sotto voce say, no. Utility isn't the same as money. But effectively, utility is the same as money because, the thing about money is that you can use it to buy whatever it is that gives you utility. So that's largely the default. I don't think there is a business school that would say our objective is to make our students as rich as we possibly can.
I can think of some that might.
Maybe, so that they can then live lives that enable them to maximize utility, since money is the fungible asset. They won't talk about that. They teach business ethics courses. Why do they teach business ethics courses? At Wharton, your alma mater, the walls are plastered with photographs of distinguished alums who have two things in common. One is that they got very rich, and the other is that they went to jail.
Well, I like to joke that they have the wall of fame, right, up above the floor, and they have the wall of shame below the floor, and they got pulling,
based on the latest trial.
Exactly, right.
But, it seems to me that being explicit about what the values are that you're trying to nurture is a good thing. But every occasion I know of where institutions embarked on an effort to define that for themselves went nowhere because an incredibly fractious faculty decided that not only did they not agree, but they right across the hall from them were moral monsters. Who also had tenure. So you can't get people to, now you can in conservative institutions who fly their flag with honor, but in liberal institutions, you just can't do it. I at least don't know how to do it. Maybe if things get bad enough, people will decide we have to put aside our petty differences and show that we stand for something. And conceivably, the threat that universities are now experiencing may be enough to get that to happen. But it will take real courage from leaders and real willingness to sustain, in the face of enormous obstacles, this movement to create mission-driven institutions that are something other than we are here so that everybody can do whatever it is they want in their lives, because all lives are equally good and equally well lived, which is sort of the default.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm deceiving myself, but all the core courses that I've taught, here at Berkeley have had the words decision-making in them somewhere, right? So it's like, data for decision making and microeconomics for decision making and financial decision making and strategic decision making. And so I like to think that I'm in some very small way contributing to these folks becoming better decision makers and hopefully becoming wiser people.
Well, there's a lot buried in the adjective you use, helping people become better decision makers. The real, the $1 million question is, what exactly does that mean?
Well, part of it is goal formulation.
Yeah.
And part of it is, goal achievement.
That is correct. And the question is whether there's a third part, which is goal evaluation.
Mm.
Having formulated goals, you step back and say, are these the goals that I should be pursuing, that we should be pursuing as a company? And, maybe there's room for some of that at a place like Haas. I don't know that there's room for a lot of it at business schools in general.
Mm.
What I got accused of when I was teaching this course at Haas was, accused of sounds critical. Some people loved it. That this was more like an undergraduate course than anything they had taken at Haas. And I took that.
That could be a compliment.
I took that as a supreme compliment.
Right. Yeah.
Because, what they said was, it wasn't just giving us tools to figure out what to do next. It was sort of getting us to ask ourselves what we should do next, what we ought to be pursuing. And, I wish there were more of it, the people who liked it said.
Well, I wonder, should business be more like some of these other professions? So, right, and Mike's at law school, it obviously varied. I spent a lot of time at 4 or 5 different law schools, but, at some of these law schools, there was this very pronounced idea that you are entering into a profession that comes with obligations to the world, obligations to society. There are certain norms and values that you have to subscribe to if you want to be part of the bar, basically. Now, I'm not sure that's observed in practice. Similarly with medicine, right? At some point, a lot of these doctors just, whatever, whoever drug company gives them the most money. But, I think most doctors would say they subscribe to a set of norms of what it means to be a doctor. Now, I'm not advocating that we create a guild of managers, right, with barriers to entry and membership and COE credits and so forth. But would there be something to inculcating a view of if you're a business decision maker, then you need to take seriously your obligations. You have to think seriously about what it is you're trying to achieve and how it squares with the broader goals that you have in your life.
And the broader goals that society has. Yeah, I think absolutely. The book that has been a touchstone for me was written by philosopher Alistair McIntyre, who recently died.
He was a professor of mine.
Really?
Yeah, Duke.
Huh.
Yeah.
And it's called After Virtue. And in the book, and the title is itself brilliant because it is both meaning after virtue as in pursuing virtue and after virtue as in living in a world after virtue has disappeared. And he thinks both of those things are true.
Well, you got virtue in all your books.
I do,
Its death has been prematurely announced.
Well, its death on the pages of a book is one thing. Its death in the actual institutions we live in is maybe a different thing. But the points he made that were particularly important to me were he defined something he calls a practice, which pursues its own telos, its own goal. So the telos of medicine is to cure disease and ease discomfort. The telos of law is to pursue justice. The telos of science is to discover truth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are certainly people who are scientists and lawyers and doctors who are not pursuing the telos. But as long as the telos is in place, and there are people who are pursuing it and policing it, disapprobation will be visited on those who deviate from the telos, especially when they're sacrificing what the profession is for in order to achieve personal gain or personal enrichment. So he says all of that. And so asking yourself, what is the telos? It seems to me ought to be question number one. And it is in medical schools and law schools the first day, and then stops.
Yeah.
And in business schools, I'm not sure it ever is.
Yeah, like what would it mean to have a telos for managers, right?
What would it mean? Fair enough question. I don't think you necessarily want me to answer it, but he also makes another point, and that point is that most things that we regard as practices require the support of institutions. You know, playing tic-tac-toe is not a practice. Playing world-class chess or world-class bridge is because of its complexity, but you can't do those things without there being institutions that enable you to compete according to a standard set of rules against people with similar aspirations and similar abilities. And he says sometimes what it takes for the institutions to survive and support themselves is not consistent with the telos that the institution is enabling. And so, you know, vice presidents of development at universities kiss asses of people they are contemptuous of, because without getting those multi-million-dollar contributions from those people, the people who work at the institution will not be able to pursue the telos efficiently. So you've got a kind of buffer zone of people that we usually are dismissive of, who are protecting us so we can have clean hands and gathering the resources that will enable us to pursue the telos effectively.
Is that an easier question to answer than the telos of the university? Because
Well, no, the challenge,
managers don't have an institution, but universities do. So
universities. So if you are a manager in an institution, arguably your telos is to enable the practitioners, that is academics, researchers, scholars, to engage in the practice in a way that enables them and thus the institution as a whole to achieve its telos. That's your job. The problem is that you can't put, a steel barrier between the people who maintain the institution and the people that the institution is maintained for. So sometimes there will be leakage. The things that you do to make sure that Berkeley's got enough money in its bank account, and the things that you do as a member of the faculty or the student body at Berkeley, one will influence the other. So the job of the manager is not simply to enable the practice to occur, but also to protect practitioners so their hands don't have to get dirty. And so there is this wall that separates the people who run the institution from the people who do what the institution's for. And it's a porous wall. And every now and then somebody steps too far and it gets noticed and some sort of a big melee occurs. There was years ago at Swarthmore, there's a guy named Adnan Khashoggi, who was one of the major arms dealers in the world. He was Middle Eastern. And he offered to Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr and Haverford a big pile of money so that they could establish a shared position in Islamic studies. This is a long time ago when this was a revolutionary idea to have Islamic studies. And listeners should know that these three schools are pretty small, so a shared position sort of made sense, at least as a start. And one of my colleagues knew who this guy was and said, if three Quaker institutions take money from an arms dealer to establish a program in Islamic studies, I'm going to make sure this is on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Well, we got the Nobel Peace Prize from a dynamite maker, right?
No, yeah. I'm not saying that out of bad, good, there's a horrible fire and it enriches the soil, and 2 years later you've got enormous regrowth. Good things can happen by accident. But this guy thought that this was such a violation of these three institutions' commitments to take money from somebody who sold death, that they were going to pay a public relations price for it. And they agreed with him and they withdrew. So it didn't actually happen. But so there, you can go too far in this effort to enable people like you and me to do what we want to do as faculty members. And
Well, if I had to go through and look at all where all my salary comes from.
no, I know it. I know it.
That's where I put the frame down. It's like,
No, and you know that, but here too, it's interesting. The issue of clean and dirty hands is an incredibly complicated
Mhm.
issue. You know, accusing someone of being complicit it's amazing how uninformative that is. We're all complicit. We all know that there are people supporting us who we have contempt for, who we think are bad people, who we think are doing bad things in the world. We all know that. Does it make us complicit that we take our paychecks? We're all complicit in a militaristic foreign policy because we pay taxes. Should we protect ourselves from being complicit by refusing to pay taxes? Back in the Vietnam days, people did that, and some of them went to jail for not paying their taxes. So the notion that it's possible to live your life with clean hands, I think, is a fiction that enables us to get through the day. But there are degrees of dirtiness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it takes judgment, wisdom, to figure out how dirty is too dirty.
Well, Barry, I like to think that you and I are in the wisdom business. But I think we have a long way to go, all of us.
Yes, we do.
But this book, Choose Wisely. Check it out. It's really cool. It's Rationality, Ethics, and the Art of Decision Making. But it's only the latest chapter in a whole bunch of different books that really help you to become better decision makers and better people.
You're very kind.
Okay, we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.